I think the hard part of DEI is that it is a long-term journey, and we get it right, and then we get it wrong, and we get it right, and we get it wrong. And we continue to work on perfecting. And we also continue to learn different things to tweak. And I want to say every organization that's trying to improve it is different. Why? Because the people in the organization are different. And so different groups are facing different things. When I talk about change and change initiatives, and I think about what does it take to create sustainability, I think there's times that we dive in. It's like, I know that we've been around since the 1950s, really talking about diversity, equity, but it seems like everything kind of hit a real boiling point at the beginning of COVID. And so then it was like this heightened aspect of, well, we really got to create communication. So it was just like this new surge of energy on the topic. And I remember you, Denise, we had the conversation when they were just starting to have conversations about it. Like, everybody's going to get into these video chats and have conversations. And it was like, whew, that's kind of scary. And what made it scary was there wasn't a defined outcome. It was like this open up and vent. And I think there's two parts of it. So when we think about doing DEI and we're trying to create spaces for people to learn to accept, we've got to be careful to make sure that we're putting ground rules in place, that we're creating realistic expectations of people when we're having those sessions. And then more importantly, that we're looking at what is the outcome we want to take from it. So we had these great conversations, but we left it at the conversation point. It wasn't like we had a conversation and said, okay, this was great. Here's now a tangible something we're going to do as a result of this conversation. And here's the something that we're going to put in place as a result of it, and get the buy-in on that next step for the commitment to make change. I think the other part in the ground rule setting of creating that DEI space for conversation is making sure that when people are coming in, that they're not just coming in with, God, I just want to vent, like, no one's heard me, I've had this problem, blah, blah, blah. But that we're coming in with an idea of what does that solution look like. And I remember that was another conversation that we had, Denise, about, God, we're having these conversations, and it's really important. Like, I know even at ASU in my Dare to Lead, I had some very intimate conversations with some different people in charge of DEI at ASU. And there's that constant, what is it that we really expect to have changed? Is it that it's this huge policy sweeping change that we're going to hire more people in a certain area? Or is it the change that when we have meetings, we're taking the extra step as individuals to make sure that the different minorities in the room, whatever it is, get the opportunity to speak? And I'm not just talking about race differences too, but I've had meetings where it's all women and two males, and the males feel like the awkward man out. So it's, how do we create that space, no matter who's in the room, to make sure that everybody has that feeling of safety? And I think that's the part that is really hard at this change level, is on a personal level, I'm going to have to be vulnerable and accept that you have a different perspective than I do. And I also have to be curious. And that's what we're really finding hard, is people are starting to shut down, and they don't want to have the curiosity of understanding the other person and what their perspective is. And so when we go to create these things, we have to be mindful to put tools into place as well to equip people to have the conversations to get there. So that's, you know, in the work with Brene, she'll give you 4 skill sets of courage. And I think whether it's Brene's work or learning conversation and having conversation, there's the aspect of when we're putting in a full DI, there's the plans of the system side of it, but there's also the tool side of it to develop the individuals and what's going on.
Yeah, the opening is really about how do we think about this in our day-to-day and kinds of interactions. And many of the folks here, I don't know about you guys, but put in the chat if you've got a little question or something. We're going to talk a little bit about the bigger concept, and then we're going to give you a chance, as always, to talk about it in small groups and then come back and speak about what your experience has been. But I want to dig a little deeper into this idea of resistance, because I think we all know that we're supposed to be leaders. I think we all know that we come to the room, we have agendas, We know what we're going to be facing, or at least I think we know what we're going to be facing. And then someone comes and kind of says that wrong thing. We talk about microaggressions, those little comments that often make you go, "Ugh," and just freeze you up. We've had conversations about that. Can you talk a little bit about what is actually happening in me when I have a microaggression?
Absolutely. We don't do anything as human beings without emotion. And our emotions are tied to our experience. And when we hear a microaggression, it's not like we instantly go, God, that person assaulted me. Inside our head, we have experienced something similar to it somewhere in our past. And our brain is connecting the physiology of what's going on to that past experience. And we get this warm wash, if you will, that rushes over us. And it's that trigger. And it's like, oh man, that comment, that something that they said triggers this vulnerable spot that we have. And it might even bring up shame, or we've been forced into shame about feeling a certain way about certain things. And so the microaggression itself by itself wasn't anything, but we've experienced it so much that has built up the emotion within us to create that want to discharge back at somebody or to run away. So even in that case of it, we might run back. We might just appease, like, I know it's not a big deal. And in our head, it's like, man, that was like a game changer for me, but we don't express it. And so even bringing up the topic of microaggressions and having conversations around them sometimes is difficult, because you have to create that safe space for somebody to be able to express, where does that angst come from what that expression has done. And so we have to tap into DEI is emotion, and it's kind of that, how do we talk about what specifically happened in that microaggression. And it takes introspection on the person that like, wow, I had that trigger. Why do I have that trigger? Should I have that trigger anymore? Is that something that I need to release? But also on the side of the other person, to let them know and to put the boundaries down, to say, hey, I wasn't comfortable with that. And I think that's the other part that we have to empower people in the DI, is to be able to know that they've got that ability to have that boundary conversation and to express themselves.
You know, I think we all have experienced, or at least have heard a couple of what you're talking about in terms of triggers. You know, have you ever gone into a meeting and you just felt like you weren't prepared, and then it looked like nobody was listening? Have you ever gone into a meeting and it feels like, you know, there's one person, particularly a male, who's just very, and you can't find a place to speak, or when you've spoken, you're not heard, or you don't feel like someone has picked up your idea in the room. It could be, you know, you're at the grocery store. You know, one of the things that sometimes I'm very hypersensitive, depending on what my news day has been, is whether, you know, the clerk will put the money in my hand or they'll put it on the table, or the thing, and then have this aversion to want to touch me, kind of thing. And that was pre-COVID. I mean, now I get a little bit different reaction on it, but it's always something that reminds me or snaps me into, because I'm a woman of color, am I different? Why are they doing this? And that is the thought that is my trigger, that I have to step back and just kind of go, okay, what else is true in the room? What other story is going on? Because sometimes it actually is, this person has these thoughts about it, but more times than not, I've found that over time, I will find that the person is just as nervous about being with me as I am with them. And so that brings me up to this idea of, one of the things as I'm working with individuals and businesses is that oftentimes we're kind of scared to not say the right thing, that we're not going to say the right thing. And so that puts a damper on our thinking and what we're going to do. How do we, you know, once we get that feeling of, oops, I might say the wrong thing, what can I do to kind of snap myself out in a moment? Because I'm really in a situation where I have to pay attention.
It's a great question. Breathe is the biggest thing. Like, take a deep breath, because at the moment that we're in that warm wash or we're in that shock moment, we need to just breathe and gather our thoughts. And sometimes we think that takes an eternity, but just taking a couple breaths to center ourselves, bring us back to the present is really important. I think the other thing then is to get curious and to start creating questions. And I think that was a big part with conversational intelligence that I learned is there's like a ton of questions that I can ask, not pointed, not like it's a yes or no, because it's like my daughter comes home, it's like, yeah. Oh, what did you get in a report card? Or what did you do? I'm asking a question because I have a certain intent. So I need to be careful, especially in that where I'm not going to attack the person by asking the question, but then I'm going to open up and just go, God, there's a story in my head that I'm creating. And maybe that's the term you use. Or it's curious to go, hey, I noticed that you did X, Y, Z. And I'm just curious where that came from. And to then unpack the story in my head that I've created to see if it's actually what's happening in reality. And so when we do that, it can open up the conversation then to go, in your case, like you're saying, you just put the money on the table. Maybe if it's a one-time transaction, you're not going to see him again, not a big deal. But if this is somebody that you're constantly in interaction with, then it's like, hey, I've noticed a couple of times when I've been in that you do this. I'm just curious, what's the reason behind that? Right. So that I can clarify what that is. Sometimes in the moment, we don't feel good about it. It's like the person that always wishes they had the sarcastic comeback. Maybe we don't have at that moment. But if we have reoccurring themes of certain things, then it's that time to step back and go, God, I've been in this situation before. Finding a mentor, finding somebody to talk to that says, God, what can I do? What are the other alternatives for me in this situation? So that the next time you face it, you have an idea of what you might say, you have an idea of what you might do. And without those, you won't step up, you won't do it within the actual meeting. And so it's really important to kind of have that rehearsed idea of what I want to do if I get triggered by this, especially if it's something that's important to you.
This idea of rehearsing and whatnot, how do we create environments where we can actually rehearse with someone else? Because sometimes, I don't know about anybody else on here, but sometimes it sounds really good in my head. And then when it comes out of my mouth, not cool, not so cool at the moment. So how do we create communities where we can actually have someone who can listen? Because nobody wants to hurt anyone's feelings, and this is about a relationship. So how, what would you give us as steps in terms of us being able to create that kind of community?
I think the difficult part sometimes is we demand it at work. Like, you guys should be able to do this at work. And that might not be the safest place. I have a gal that was in my Dare to Lead last quarter, and she literally got out of it because there were people in there and she's like, God, it's just too close. It's too sensitive. I can't. She knew she needed to, but she just couldn't. And she's back this semester because she's gotten herself in a better spot. So important that we sometimes have people inside of work, yes, that we've created a connection with, maybe their peers, maybe their a mentor that we know we can look to. Sometimes it's important to have them outside of work or even across a department. And in what I've been doing, I am trying to create those connections where people are maybe even getting out of their department to create those new spaces for them and creating the ground rules, the connection rules, and the accountability, and teaching them what is a good relationship. And so sometimes people just need that opportunity to meet other people and go, God, yeah, Denise and I, we share that same common, like, can I reach out to you on these situations? And for us as individuals, we need to be able to ask permission when we build those relationships to make sure that the other person's ready to make those commitments, and that we, as a mutual thing, when we define it like, hey, I'm going to come to you to talk to you about certain things. Is that okay? Yeah, that's okay. And we've agreed to what that looks like, so that we can have it. But it's very important. They say we should have at least 2 to 3 people that we can have those type of conversations with. So if I'm struggling at work, I may not want to share at work because it's going to come across the wrong way, or somebody's going to hear it and it's going to get spread as rumor. And so we might want that outside work relationship where I know I can just get a hold of someone. And LeadHERship Global is a great place to make those type of connections, because you're going to have some very powerful leaders, different people that have faced very, very similar situations, but it's a safe space from the standpoint that what you talk about, is going to be kept within this space. The other thing is, because sometimes when we're so in our area, we just get the same feedback all the time. It's really great to get that outside perspective and have the other person go, gosh, I heard what you were saying, but my thought went to this or something like that, to give us that fresh idea of what might be there or what it is that we're experiencing. So
what I heard you say is, in these community, however it is, it's an intentional decision to have a community and to show up for that community, that we ask permission to be that kind of mentor and sounding board for other individuals and for that. And the one that you didn't highlight as much, but I do want to, is I think we have to look at our community or the people that we have on our board and ask, how many of them are not like me? So that we get the diversity of perspectives in our field, or at least our listening, so that we can practice in a safe space of what's going on. I have one last question, and then I want to move to breakouts. Do you have there's a difference between being an agent of change versus a change agent. And for most of the women on here, they're really agents of change. They're trying to convince someone else to do something different. Do you have any tips for that?
An agent of change. You need to know who your early adopters are and make sure that you get some people on board with you. Look at who the stakeholders are within a group, a company, and not from the standpoint of position, but influence. I find sometimes when I'm trying to deal with my initiative that the leader isn't the one that I need to get a hold of. It's the second assistant next to them. So it's really important to get the early adopters and supporters on board with you. To be a change agent too, you have to be able to create the positive vision, not a goal, like not just hard step goals of what I want to do, but that larger, God, if we dream, like they say, Martin Luther King had a dream. He didn't have a plan, although he did have a lot of planning behind how do we create that dream and make it reality. But we've got to have that larger something that we're trying to get to, and people can see that tangibly, feel that tangibly, and then be able to understand if that's what we're after, what are the small things we can do today, the micro steps that we can take, the micro habits that we can change that will help us get there. And I just got a new book, so I have to flash it up here. It's called Forget, Quit, and Undone. Get It Done. And I thought this was it was just something that came up by Carol DeWick this last week. It's just out on the press. And she said that it's really interesting how when we start doing initiatives, we get that momentum in the beginning, like when somebody goes to school for the first time and there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of hype and away we go, right? Awesome. And then we'll like the graduation, we have the big ceremony at the end and we've made it and we're here. But we forget about the middle part where we start getting the fatigue and we're like, oh my gosh, like we've got 2 years of these Zoom meetings and we don't do something in the middle to continue to create that excitement and to continue to acknowledge the progress that's being made. So when we're trying to be change agents, we've got to be mindful that it's not just this beginning and okay, we did this, but we have to somewhere at a point go, God, look how far we've come. Like, look at the things that we have in place and some of the things that are working and celebrate that so that people keep that excitement going instead of just going, oh yeah, we didn't make that quota again. We didn't do this again. We didn't. That we're keeping that momentum and that we acknowledge the baby steps along the way. And I think the other part to get it as a really changed culture is when we can get the individuals to start recognizing it in each other and to recognize, gosh, I saw you stand up for that person in the meeting. That was so awesome. You gave me an idea of how to do it. When we can start creating a way for people to reward each other when we're making those initiatives is really huge, because this is a destination. I don't think we're ever going to completely get to the end of, just like we're fighting, we were supposed to fight for freedom for everybody. Like we are still fighting that fight and we might not get to the end, but what have we conquered along the way? Where have we been successful? And to have people, again, acknowledge that with each other. I think that is huge in making that change. And I think that's the other part that we have to be good about clarifying is we're not going into this expecting everybody to make this momentum change. We're going into it to increase awareness. We're going into it for people to be more mindful. We're going into it for everybody to learn to grow. And I think that's the benefit of it. but that we're also going in with that idea that when we see the little process, the little things that have made a big difference, that we start to reward those.
Great. Okay, so now is the time where you guys are going to help us figure out how to help each other. This is a forum in which, we're trying to create a way in which we find those voices, that network of people who, when you need a sounding board and you want to practice things, you get people who give you good ideas. So we're